You're going to present some evidence today that dinosaurs are not as old as we think. What are those evidences?
Well, we're going to deal with 5. And first one is theological evidence. Is there any conflict between the Bible's idea of dinosaurs and humans living together? We're going to look at archaeological evidence that suggests humans saw dinosaurs. We're going to look at the fossil evidence. Is the fossil evidence really a supporting strength for the idea that dinosaurs lived and died millions of years ago? And then we're going to look at soft tissue finds in dinosaur fossils. And the last one, we're going to look at carbon-14, which people think proves millions of years, but we're going to find it's no friend when it comes to the age of dinosaurs.
So what you've presented today, Gary, seems almost unbelievable. But why don't most people hear about this evidence really at all?
Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think that
we're often taught that dinosaurs lived and died millions or hundreds of millions of years ago. But Gary, you've lectured on this topic before. You're going to present some evidence today that dinosaurs are not as old as we think. What are those evidences?
Well, we're going to deal with 5. And first one is we're going to look at theological evidence. Okay? Is there any conflict between the Bible's idea of dinosaurs and humans living together? We're going to look at archaeological evidence that suggests humans saw dinosaurs. We're going to look at the fossil evidence. Is the fossil evidence really a supporting strength for the idea that dinosaurs lived and died millions of years ago? And then we're going to look at soft tissue finds in dinosaur fossils. And the last one, we're going to look at carbon-14, which people thinks proves millions of years, but we're going to find it's no friend when it comes to the age of dinosaurs.
That sounds super interesting, Gary. And also, I hinted at your credentials earlier, but I might actually dive a bit deeper into that. I said that you've lectured on these sorts of topics before, but Gary, you've actually been lecturing longer than I've been alive. You've been doing creation ministry work for about 30 years now. You've authored 9 books and co-authored with those as well. You've lectured thousands of times all over the world, and you've produced documentaries as well. So you've said when it comes to lecturing on biblical creation, the topic of dinosaurs almost always comes up. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, just not for me, but any creation speaker would have that experience. One is dinosaurs are fascinating creatures. We've seen them portrayed in the media and we've made movies about them. And they're always associated with this evolutionary, like you said, millions of years of history. I kind of call them almost the poster child for evolution. So even for Christians, even Christians who don't believe in evolution, we've got this mindset that, dinosaurs equals millions of years. Now, when we read the Bible's clear account of biblical creation, God created, the larger groups of animals, organisms over those 6 days and the matter of the universe and the earth, etc. And that's clearly only thousands of years ago. So if dinosaurs in people's mindset equals millions of years, but the Bible says creation's thousands of years ago, how do we reconcile the two? And sadly, some Christians have come up with some wild ideas like, well, maybe Satan created dinosaur fossils in the rocks to confuse everybody or something like that. The answers are really much, much more simple and straightforward. The simple fact is dinosaurs did exist. We've got their fossils. We have billions of dinosaur footprints around the world. And I think when we look at the 5 points we're going to look at, we're going to see that actually hard scientific evidence, physical evidence actually supports the biblical view of these creatures rather than the evolutionary view.
We'll get back to the interview in just a second, but first, I'd like to thank you for watching these videos. And if you aren't subscribed, please subscribe and ring that notification bell, as it helps us create more content like this. Let's get back to the interview. So, Gary, you've said that there are 5 lines of evidence that can be used to refute this idea of evolutionary age of dinosaurs. What's number 1?
Well, number 1, I'm going to start with theological evidence, right? Not so much scientific evidence that we'll get to. And the reason I want to do that is as we present the scientific evidence, we'll see that it fits the theological perspective as we go along.
Yeah, all right.
So, people will say, well, Gary, you don't see dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible. We're going to talk about that, for example. So when God created those 6 24-hour days, he created large groups. So, for example, on day 5, he created the flying creatures. That's what it says. Doesn't specifically say birds, but birds would be included in flying creatures. What are some of the other flying creatures we'd think about? Talking about dinosaurs, what about pterodactyls or pteranodons? They're flying creatures. So if they really existed, and according to biblical creation, they must have been created on day 5. So then think about some of the sauropods or theropods or T-Rex, for example. When were they created? Well, God created the land animals, the remes, Hebrew, on day 6, along with human beings. So they're right off, that says that dinosaurs, according to biblical creation, and man were contemporary. But in the evolutionary view, if human beings, Homo sapiens, were only recent arrivals on the Earth 200, now they're saying 300,000 years ago, there's a 65 million year old difference, according to evolution, between when the last dinosaur existed and when the first humans appeared. The biblical creationist view would actually have dinosaurs and humans living together, which is, sounds completely crazy to most people because according to evolution, the last dinosaur died out 65 million years ago, and humans, Homo sapiens, were only recent arrivals on the Earth maybe 200 or 300,000 years ago. So they're separated by tens of millions of years of time.
Yes, so some would point out that dinosaurs are not actually mentioned in the Bible and would refute the idea that man and dinosaurs were actually contemporary. What do you have to say about that?
Well, the Bible's silent about a lot of things. It doesn't talk about motor cars, but we know motor cars existed and computers and etc. Look, it's not an argument from silence. So I've got some notes because I want to read out some biblical passages that explain this. So one of the areas we look at in Scripture is in the book of Job, and we go into Job 40. Now, for people who are not familiar, the story of Job is that he was a wealthy man. He had lots of possessions and families. And Satan came and presented himself before God and said, hey, look at Job. You only give Job all this wealth and this blessing, right? And the only reason he's worshipping you is because he's got all of this. So poor Job goes through all of this testing and great difficulties. And what's fascinating, towards the end of the book, when Job is struggling and he's diseased, God starts to speak to him through creation passages. And what he's doing to Job, he's saying, look at aspects of creation. I made these, right? And I made you. And he's kind of trying to reassure Job that he's seeing him in his plight. And one of the things he points to is this creature called Behemoth. So let's read it. He says here in Job 40, 15 to 18, behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, strength in his loins and the power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are like tubes of bronze, limbs like bars of iron. And there are another description in 1920 where he's actually in the River Jordan, this creature with his mouth against the surge. So, okay, same. The word dinosaur is not mentioned there, but let's have a look at the description of the creature. I think this, and others do, that this is a sauropod dinosaur. They're the ones with the huge long necks and the huge long tails, okay? And it describes him obviously having bones like tubes of bronze and limbs like bars of iron. But the real clue here is it says he has a tail stiff like a cedar. Now, presumably Job lived in the Middle East, and that's where Solomon built the temple from, the cedars of Lebanon. These are huge stand of trees. In fact, the ancient Egyptians used to send expeditions to that area because they had no natural wood themselves. So I often just ask people to say, can you tell me a land animal today that has a tail as long as a great big tree, a stiff, long tree?
I definitely couldn't think of one myself.
No. So even that little bit there gives us an indication that it's probably talking about a sauropod dinosaur. But notice the name Behemoth. This is the word left untranslated in Scripture. It's not dinosaur. Why? Because the word dinosaur is a modern word, just like those other modern words I mentioned today. In fact, it wasn't invented until 1841 with a scientist by the name of Richard Owen. They found these fossil bones of creatures that they didn't immediately recognize as creatures living today. When they looked at them, they said, well, they kind of look reptilian or lizard-like. And the word dinosaur is actually a Greek term meaning terrible lizard or fearsome lizard. So dinosaur is a modern word. So when we look at the Bible and even the ancients that we're going to look at, they're not going to use the word dinosaur because that word didn't even exist then. So that's one of the issues. I want to mention something else about that Job passage too. I think it's incredibly encouraging. that towards the end, Job, he hasn't seen the advent of Christ or anything like that, but he has that passage where he stands upon the earth and he says, I know in my own eyes, on my own flesh, I will see God. There's a lesson for us there, that he just believed God as creator. Right? And if he's the creator, he knew he was capable of raising his bones back from the grave into a future restored creation. And I think that's why when we talk about aspects of creation, it's very, very important, because it points to who actually God is.
Okay, so we've mentioned that dinosaurs could have actually been mentioned in the Bible, but just not maybe under the name that we're so familiar with. But are there any other records elsewhere historically that show depictions or descriptions of dinosaurs?
Yes, we do. The ancients used to call these creatures dragons, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But there are hundreds of examples in statues, in paintings, all over the world, where people have depicted animals that look suspiciously like what we might call dinosaurs today. Now, obviously, when evolutionists look at those, they would be immediately dismissed because, there's tens of millions of years between humans and dinosaurs. And I brought along a couple of pictures here, and I want to kind of refer to my notes as well. Before I do, I just want to caution also that we have to be careful about trying to see, as Christians, dinosaurs in everything. It's a very, very difficult area to deal with, as we'll discuss. But there's one that often comes up when myself and my colleagues lecture, and that's called the Paluxy River footprints. So in Glen Rose, Texas, there's a riverbed exposed where we can clearly see dinosaur footprints. Remember I said there are billions of them around the world. And then next to them is something that looks suspiciously like human footprints.
Okay.
But we've sent researchers there, and other creationist organizations have sent researchers there. And what we're looking at are actually more weathered and eroded footprints of dinosaurs that have given the appearance of human footprints. So I just want to have a cautionary tale as we look at this. There's one not to use. In fact, people can go to creation.com, and we've got a whole section there on arguments creationists should not use, and the Paluxy River footprints is one. And the other thing, James, there's much better evidences to use rather than using dubious ones.
So not worth hanging our hat on something like that. There's actually more for us to see.
Yeah, and much more exciting. So here's the first one. So I got a couple of pictures here. So in Carlisle Cathedral, this is an Anglican cathedral in the very north of England, close to the border of Scotland. A bishop was buried in the cathedral. His name was Bishop Bell. And you can go there and you can see his tomb. And interred, I think it was 1496, he was buried there. And there were these brass strips or inlays in his tomb. And around some of the brass inlays, there are creatures that have been engraved on the brass. Now, if you look at these, you can clearly make out what they are. I've got them there. But now, they're not entirely exactly or accurate representations, but it's pretty clear to make out what they are. We've got a bat, we've got a fish, we've got a dog, and notice with the dog here, it's got a collar on, so it's probably representing somebody's pet, a bird. But then when we go over, we have this interesting depiction. And we have, I believe, two necking sauropods. Now, notice the tails. We already discussed that sauropods have a large tail. This one over here, the tail is quite plain. Look at the spikes on this tail and the cleft. There are only two dinosaurs with this feature, but most likely we think it's this sauropod by the name of Shunosaurus. So the engraver has given us enough detail on the tail for us, I believe, to say this is unlike any other creature except a Shunosaurus. So again, when was this? 1496.
Well after these things should have been dead.
Exactly. So I think, that's a really, really good example. There's another one that often comes up, and there's been a lot of debate about this. This is in Cambodia, and people have probably heard about the huge Angkor Wat complex. Angkor Wat is not a temple. It's a massive kind of city where there are lots of different temples. But in a temple called Ta Prohm, there's a pillar with these sculptures and engravings in there. And elsewhere on the pillar, we immediately recognize there's a human, there's an iguana, there's a deer, but then we get this creature here. And you can see it's got these bony or plates on the back, and it looks suspiciously like a Stegosaurus. And in fact, myself and other CEOs, we had an international meeting in Cambodia some years ago, and on one of the days off, we went out to look at the temple to see if we could go and have a look at this. And we were all saying, well, we don't know where to find it. It's so massive. And I said, well, let's just ask one of the local guides. And I just said to him, do you know where the Stegosaurus is? And he goes, oh, yeah. so even they recognize that people are recognizing this as a Stegosaurus. Now, some have said, for example, that these, what we think are bony plates on the back, might be decorations like lotus leaves or something else. But in all of the other depictions that we recognize as real animals, I mean, they're realistically depicted so that we know what they are, we don't see those illustrations. And a closer look, actually, when you get to the side of this engraving, because it's etched into it, these bony plates are actually on the back. They're actually on the back of this creature. They're not recessed as if a background decoration. So clearly the artist meant to display these as part of the creature. And simply, if I remove those, I would say, what else are we looking at? Is it mythical? Well, why put a mythical creature when everything else is real? Or if it's unrealistically portrayed, that doesn't fit with what else we're seeing there. Now, there are some features of it that don't fit a Stegosaurus, but, we've previously written on creation.com, we could be looking at a subvariant or another subspecies or something like that. Some have suggested that it might be an Asian rhino, but, we don't see Asian rhinos with long tails as well. So, we are looking at a glass fairly dimly when we look at these, and I believe there is some room for different interpretation. But I think what I'm saying there is we should neither be dogmatic that they are or they aren't. The point I'm making is there are hundreds of illustrations all around the world in different forms of creatures that look suspiciously like dinosaurs that we know from the fossil record. We're trying to interpret what is the sculptor or the artist trying to portray, right? We were not there to see it. So I've just recently come back from China.
All right.
And in the temples there, they have lots and lots of creatures representing all sorts of things. Now, everything in China has meaning. I'm going to show you a picture here. All right. And I'm going to say to you, let me turn that around. What do you think that looks like?
It looks remarkably dragon-like, but not quite. No wings.
It's actually a lion.
Oh.
and this is a modern representation, but we do see much, much older ones, but they're very consistent in their portrayal. So a lion was a symbol of power and authority, and they're always pictured out the front of the temples to ward off evil spirits in their belief system. So when I look at that, I couldn't make out that's a lion, but it is. The point here is it's been stylistically represented in terms to do the job that it's meant to do, to scare off evil spirits. Doesn't look like a lion that we know today, but that's what they are. That's what they were represented as, or written as consistently when you see them, lions. And here's another one. This is a tortoise. I mean, look how fearsome it looks. It doesn't look like a tortoise today. Again, it's there to do a specific job. Now, interestingly, the Chinese, one of the foremost countries when it comes to calling some ancient creatures dragons.
Yes.
And they're all over the place. You see these dragon depictions on temples, on the floors. Sometimes you see them with wings, etc. Now, dragons were a symbol of power in China and also there to control the weather. So they would even give offerings to these dragons because they wanted a good harvest or something like this. Now, it's interesting, in the Chinese zodiac, okay, you've probably heard that they might have a year of the pig, a year of the rooster, a year of the dog. There are some others there, a rat, ox, horse, tiger, snake, monkey. Now, they're all real creatures that we know, but they also have in the Chinese zodiac a year of the dragon, right? So why would we have, again, all of these real creatures in the Chinese zodiac, and then they mention a dragon, which, apparently, according to evolutionists, must be something mythical. Remember I said the word dinosaur was a modern word?
Yes.
Why are we talking about dragons? Because this seems to be the word, and we've seen it in many countries and many cultures that they used this word dragon to depict some sort of ancient creature that we don't necessarily see today. But in people's minds, because of movies and that type of stuff, when we hear dragon, we tend to think of it as some sort of mythical creature. And there's another point there too. We have a lot of writings from ancient China, and emperors, it tells us that they used to have dragon breeders and dragon rearers or trainers within their court. And there are depictions of creatures that look suspiciously like small sauropods, for example, actually even pulling chariots in China. So clearly the Chinese, it seems from everything that we see there, they're referring to real creatures. What are they? We have depictions of them. And again, some of them are stylistic like this, but they certainly look like dinosaurs and a great range of dinosaurs as well.
Yeah, and it wouldn't really make sense to have dragon trainers and tamers if there was no dragons to tame or train. That would just be a fictitious, position to hold.
Yeah, why write about them? And then they're also included, as I say, in the Chinese zodiac, along with all those other creatures that are absolutely real. There's another one that we've probably all heard of too, which is St. George and the Dragon. This is a story of an English knight. Just here, this is the flag of Wales, which has this dragon emblem on it. And, often Welsh sporting teams are kind of known as the Dragons, etc. Now, the English flag has a red cross on it, okay, and that's known as the Cross of St. George. So who was St. George? So St. George was the story of, and I've got to get my dates right here, it goes back to Libya, North Africa, where apparently he killed this hissing dragon in a cave. And so it's gone down throughout history. He's celebrated, it's a sign of chivalry when you talk about St. George, etc. And all over Europe, you'll see different depictions of St. George killing this dragon-like creature. Now, some of the depictions look very realistic in terms of they look like creatures that we know to be dinosaurs. And I want to show you something here, because in a past episode of Creation magazine, there was an article featured here that when they looked at depictions of St. George, so I'll turn around so you can see it. So here's a classic one you might see in a church window, for example. But other artists around Europe, when they were obviously asked to recreate for their churches or their monuments the story of St. George and the dragon, they drew dragons that they were familiar with. And here are just some of the range of dinosaurs that have been depicted around Europe as representing dragons. So the point there is, they might not have seen the actual dragon that St. George killed, but when they were asked to represent a dragon, they represented dragons that they knew about.
Dragons that they'd seen.
Yes, and they look like dinosaurs that we see, again, from the fossil record. So there are more and more. There's a fantastic book called Dire Dragons that people can get on creation.com, and it specifically deals with all of these examples of where humans have probably seen dinosaurs. And the book is called Dire Dragons. Remember, that's the name that the ancients would have called them.
Well, when it comes to this topic, so we can see that there's been depictions historically of these dragon-esque or dinosaurs, as we might like to call them. But when it comes to the fossil record, evolutionists seem to think that they've got a fairly strong grasp on that, dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. Is there anything you could say to maybe refute something like that?
So why do they come up with an age of millions of years for dinosaurs? Well, most people would probably say, it's radiometric dating or carbon-14 dating. We're going to talk about that. The age of fossils assigned to fossils usually comes from their positions in the geologic record, the rock layers.
All right.
Okay? So they would say, how old is the rock? Well, typically what type of fossils might we find in them? And then they look at, the fossils and they might say, well, what type of rock did we find it in? So it's a little bit circular in its argumentation. But the view is, when we see the geologic column, and that's that, all the rock layers, we see it in biology and geology textbooks with these certain rock strata, and what they call index fossils, or typically the types of fossils that you'll see in them. As I mentioned, there's a Mesozoic, and then there are these 3 subperiods in there. So they believe that geologic record is a history of Earth, on Earth, and timeframes of the deposition of those rock layers, sedimentary layers often. That means these are things like sandstone and limestone that are laid down by the accumulation of particles in water, etc. And what a lot of people don't know, when you look at it, you get the impression that there's this equal distribution of fossils throughout the layers. Right?
Well, it makes sense as sediment settles, things die, and there would be things all throughout.
So right at the very bottom, we might have the Precambrian and then the Cambrian, and then we go up and you'll see, the dinosaurs somewhere in the middle. But the point is, out of all the fossils that are supposed to represent the geologic record, less than 5% are vertebrates, things with a backbone. Well over 95% are creatures that just would typically inhabit and live on the ocean floor.
All right.
So why is this significant in terms of what we're talking about? Well, we believe that the majority of the rock layers around the Earth were laid down during the year-long flood of Noah's time. So if there really was a global flood, okay, what would the likelihood be? Well, the Bible first tells us that the fountains of the great deep broke open. So we're talking about, we believe, the deep oceans, crust breaking open. So what happens? Okay, if there was an original supercontinent, like a lot of us think there was, because you can kind of fit the continents together now, and they say they're moving apart slowly, a couple of centimeters per year, something called continental drift. We believe that's an accelerated process during the flood. So let me simplify this. Perhaps people can remember looking at some of the tsunamis we've seen on TV. There was one off the coast of Indonesia, I think it was 2005, the Japanese tsunami of a few years ago. It's very interesting. So what happens there is a subduction event. So two tectonic plates bash up against each other. Sometimes one pops up and creates a tsunami wave, or in the case, one might sink or subduct and it sucks water down and then it releases it like an energy wave. And that energy wave can go thousands of kilometers across oceans. So when that's happening, I want you to think about that. You can actually go onto YouTube and you can see during that Japanese tsunami events, fishing boats that are on the water, and they can see the tsunami wave coming, but it's not a wave, it's a swell. So in the ocean, the boat just goes up and it goes down. But then we look at the videos of when the wave reached the shore. What happens? It inundates the shore kilometers inland. And can anybody ever remember the color of the water? It was black. The water is black, and when it leaves silt and sediments on the land. And the reason is, when that tsunami wave rolls across the ocean floor, traveling at probably 160, 180 kilometers an hour, it's churning up the sea floor as it moves. Creatures that live on the ocean floor in situ are likely to be buried where they are. Vertebrates, majority land animals, what's going to happen as the water egresses on the land? We're not necessarily going to get buried. They're going to drown. They're going to float and bloat and rot. So in fact, what we see in the geologic column with the scarcity of vertebrate fossils, I believe is consistent with what you'd expect with a global flood. Majority of the fossil record are marine creatures that live on the ocean floor, and we see very, very few vertebrates, etc. So that's the first thing to remember. In fact, more than that, when we're talking about dinosaurs, there's only around about 11,000 dinosaur fossils have ever been found. So it's not like we have millions and millions of dinosaur fossils. We have billions of fossils, but only a few thousand dinosaur fossils. But we have billions of dinosaur footprints. So here's something to think about. If you leave a footprint impression in mud or sand, how does the slow, gradual idea, of burial preserve a footprint in that case? If you want to preserve a footprint in the mud, you need to chuck a bucket of cement on it or plaster or something, preserve it. So that also gives us an indication that lots and lots of creatures were trying to escape rising floodwaters, left their footprints in the sand and the mud, and those footprints got fossilized, but the creatures themselves drowned, as I said, and probably perished, and could have even been eaten up by other marine organisms later on.
And so all of that would have had to have happened very quickly as well.
Exactly. And we need a large catastrophic event. Guess what? Noah's flood.
That makes all the sense. Well, then, is there anything in the fossil record that actually speaks against the evolutionary perspective?
Yeah, actually, there is a lot, and I want to mention a few. And if it's okay, I just want to refer to some notes here to make sure that I get my dates correct. So first off, we have to say that according to evolution, dinosaurs are very ancient creatures, and creatures like birds, flowering plants, grass, mammals are supposed to appeared tens of millions of years after the last dinosaur died out. So just to recap, we've said age of dinosaur comes from the rock layers, their position, right? What else do we find in those rock layers where the dinosaurs, that era or that epoch where dinosaurs supposedly existed? So it's a huge list here. They found pollen, flowering plants. In fact, they were found in the Precambrian, some of the very, very oldest rocks on Earth, long before the dinosaurs even existed, yet we're told that these flowering plants and pollen only came about after dinosaurs existed. So that was a prediction that was made. We've now found evidence that falsifies that. Grass has been found in fossilized coprolites. Coprolite is fossilized dinosaur dung, all right, or dinosaur poo, if you want to call it that. Grass is not supposed to have evolved until 10 million years after the last dinosaurs existed. They've got moss, cycads, ferns. And when we look back at these ferns in the fossil record that are supposed to be tens of millions of years old, they look exactly the same as plants we see today. So there's been no evolution of those plants. Another really interesting one here in Australia was some years ago, they found a pine in a forest out in Wollemi State Forest at the back of Sydney, New South Wales. It's called the Wollemi Pine. Now, they only knew about the existence of this Wollemi pine from the fossil record. Right? They hadn't ever seen it existed. But when they found this tree, they were so excited. They actually used the term, it was like finding a living dinosaur. Why? Because I said that pine tree had only previously been known about from fossil or rock layers where dinosaur fossils had been found in. So Wollemi pines exist today. Okay, so it shows, again, the interpretation of the fossil record is not complete. Another good example of this, actually one of my favourite, not so much to do with the dinosaurs, is a fish called the coelacanth. And this was supposed to have died out 65 million years ago at the end of the age of the dinosaurs. And it was often depicted, I've seen fossil pictures of it, that it had these large fins, and apparently these were precursors, the fish walking, so that, fish gradually evolved and came onto the land as well. But then somebody saw a coelacanth, Marjorie Latimer Mortimer was the name, a scientist, saw it being sold in a fish market in Africa.
Someone was eating it.
Yeah, and since then now they've got undersea footage off the coast of Africa and Indonesia, and that exists today. So
and that sort of also then proves the point that they weren't trying to walk out of the water. In fact, they're still using their fins today
for swimming. Yeah, they're designed to do what they do. Go figure. Yeah, exactly. So there are some more too. I want to read out. So there's another one they only discovered a few years ago. Laos, which is a country in Southeast Asia, they found something called a Laotian Rock Rat. So it's a rat. Okay, and again, it was only known from fossils and believed to have gone extinct about 11 million years ago. The rat's running around the jungle, so it still exists today. So were the fossils of that rat really 11 million years old?
Probably not.
Probably not, exactly. So it brings into question the interpretation of the fossil record. But here's a couple that are really interesting. According to evolutionary theory, the modern view is that dinosaurs became extinct and because they evolved into birds. They grew feathers and wings and became birds. Well, they found a fossil of a true beaked bird known as Confuscisornis. So this is a true bird, and they found it in the stomach of a dinosaur in late Cretaceous rock. So they're supposed to have evolved into birds, but actually we now have dinosaurs eating birds.
Right, and it was its lunch.
Exactly.
It ate it a few million years too early, apparently.
So since then, they found other modern birds, including parrots that exist today. They found ducks, squirrels, platypus, beaver, and beaver-like, badger-like creatures, all found in dinosaur-era rock layers. So I repeat again, the interpretation of the fossil record where the alleged age of dinosaurs comes from is wanting. And it calls into question the whole concept theory of biological evolution on the Earth when we've got what we call all of these out-of-order fossils. And we're finding more and more and more of them. And again, people go to creation.com, type in out-of-order fossils, and they'll see numerous articles on the subject there.
So there could be, in fact, this idea that ducks were, in fact, hanging around at the same time that these dinosaurs were walking around, and we still see ducks today.
Exactly. Exactly.
They haven't changed in any sort of major way, but they're still hanging around.
Yeah. Well, evolutionists might argue that, well, if you don't see change, that's not a big problem. It's something called stasis. Something may have reached evolutionary perfection, or there's less selection pressures on it and why it hasn't changed. But that doesn't make any sense. And in fact, I'm glad you raised that question, because it brings up a point, because evolution is all about reproduction. You're being the most fit to survive in certain environments.
Yes.
And, it was often called survival of the fittest, right? So everything around you is developing better ways to survive and outbreed you and outcompete you and eat you.
Yeah.
But then to say, well, you're just going to sit here and not develop or evolve better characteristics to survive in that environment doesn't make sense. So that would be another conflicting idea, I believe, with evolutionary theory.
And I feel like, especially in the context of maybe a duck, I can't say they're the most fearsome creatures I've ever come across.
No. I just went to China. I ate plenty of them.
Well, there have been finds of soft tissues in dinosaur fossils. What does this do for the presumed evolutionary age of dinosaurs?
Yeah, this is actually, we're getting down now to where the rubber meets the road. This is some hard scientific physical evidence that really flies in the face of the millions of years age for dinosaurs. So in the 1980s, a scientist by the name of Mary Schweitzer, a paleontologist, looking under a microscope, and she noticed what she thought were red blood cells, from a dinosaur fossil. Now, we're not talking about fossilized blood cells or anything. We're talking about still in its organic state.
All right.
And her PhD mentor, when she was studying for her own PhD, was kind of guy they called Mr. Dinosaur, is Jack Horner, very, very famous. And when she showed him, he said, "Prove to me that it's not." Now, that's the actual correct scientific method. If I have a scientific theory, I can do a bunch of tests to try to say, well, look, this works. But what you actually have to do is to try to do scientific tests to disprove it. So I want to be accurate here in representing her. So I'd like to read from some notes, because I've got a quote. I've got a quote from her. So Schweitzer herself said, "As the fossil dissolved, transparent vessels were left behind." She said, "It was totally shocking." She says, "I didn't believe it until we'd done it 17 times.
Wow.
And this was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. But of course, I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old." Hang on. So she's confronted with evidence that defies the 65 million year old belief. But even after being confronted with it, she still says at the end, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. So there's a point there that, the paradigm, the worldview that's in place is the overarching rule. Okay? It's not the evidence speaking for itself. And she went on to say, how could blood cells survive that long? And then later on, they found some more fossils in a T-Rex leg bone, and there were blood vessels and ligaments. And you can, again, go onto YouTube and you can see where they're stretching it with tweezers. It's still soft and stretchy. James, it's supposed to be 65 million years old. So since then, they found other things. They found proteins, collagen, elastin, laminin, skin cells, etc. Some of them are up to now 195 million years old. This was one called Lufengosaurus, protein remains. So much older than 65 million years old. So they're going back and back and back and still finding soft tissue claims. But James, as they say on the steak knives advert, but wait, there's more, okay? They've now found unfossilized DNA in dinosaur bones and dinosaur fossils. So DNA, what is it? So in the nucleus of cells of every living creature, there is this computer code, and it tells the cells what to build. It tells the cells to build machines that control all sorts of aspects in the cell. Now, it's very, very interesting that every time our cells reproduce, as we're sitting here now, our cells are reproducing, but we carry letter mistakes or mutations forward. Now, the DNA also codes for these incredible repair machines that try to repair the letters. Now, it doesn't get them all. And unfortunately, they accumulate mutations. That's why we and other organisms will eventually die. But the point of mentioning that is at the moment of death, that machinery stops working, it breaks down. And so DNA, being an extremely fragile molecule, decays very, very quickly. Now, even if you were to freeze DNA, okay, it would not survive more than 125,000 years.
125,000 years?
Yes, it would decay. That's if you froze it, so it would still continue to break down. But again, we're finding DNA apparently in dinosaur fossils that are tens of millions of years old. So this is really, really exciting. Now, would we expect to find, or soft tissue DNA if dinosaur fossils maybe were only thousands of years old? Does it make more sense that we'd be more likely to find it under that scenario?
Well, that would make sense. If it's 125,000 years being fully frozen, you would have to expect it's some shorter time frame than that.
Yeah. So if you'd have said, if I could be frank here, I've been in ministry for 30 years. Let's say 30 years ago, if you'd have said to a paleontologist, we might find soft tissue or DNA in dinosaur fossils, it would have been ridiculed. You're not going to find it. You can't. They're tens of millions of years old. So they have found it. Has that changed their view of the age of dinosaurs? No. So what happens is they look for reasons as to why soft tissue might last for tens of millions of years.
Solve a problem for a problem that arises in your theory. You got to find a solution, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that I can understand that's fair enough, but I'm going to suggest that the solutions they've come up with also don't work. So they've suggested, because they found some iron chemicals, if you like, in some of the samples, they've suggested that iron-rich solutions have surrounded the burial of some of these fossils, and that actually preserves it. But I actually have some notes here, because iron doesn't actually do that. It actually helps to break it down. It's not a protective barrier for soft tissue. Iron can cause protein degradation and cellular damage. Okay? So here's the thing. Even if some iron-rich solution could preserve a fossil, how do you test it over millions of years scientifically? You can't. So that's one. You're not going to be around to observe it. And secondly, they found dinosaur fossils and soft protein in numerous continents, spanning tens of millions of years of the evolutionary age for these creatures. So what are the chances that by chance random processes, you just happen to get the correct iron-rich solutions over here 195 million years ago, and then over in this country or this continent 65 million years ago? I would suggest that's special pleading to suggest that, by chance, the right concoction of chemicals came up over tens of millions of years to preserve soft tissue. And again, to repeat, we're finding that iron-rich solutions actually don't preserve soft tissue anyway. They help break it down. So I know someone might make in the comments, oh, hang on, they found iron-rich solutions can preserve it. Well, hopefully I've just answered that. It doesn't.
I hope you're enjoying this interview so far. Creating content like this takes a considerable amount of time, effort, and resources. We're passionate about getting this message out, and we want to keep bringing you more videos like this one. But here's the thing. We need your help to make that happen. Your support, no matter how big or small, will help us cover our production costs and enable us to continue creating impactful content. To support this project, just use the link in the description below or the on-screen prompt. We're so thankful for your support. So far, Gary, we've covered 4 lines of evidence. We've covered the theological, we've covered the archaeological, we've covered the fossil, and we've covered the soft tissue evidence that's been presented. Is there a final 5th one that we're going to cover today?
Yeah, there is, and I think the 5th one for me is the slam dunk of it all, and we're going to talk about radiometric dating. Okay, so this is where we're going to talk about carbon-14. So carbon-14 dating, people believe, They often cite it in terms of millions of years because it's the one we most hear about on the TV. Carbon-14 dating can actually only date things in terms of thousands of years. And the reason is all radioactive isotopes have a half-life. That is, they decay by their original amount. In case of uranium lead, it's probably 500 million years. But carbon-14 is 5,730 years, right? So you find a fossil, it's got 20 carbon-14 atoms in it. So they presume, 5,730 years ago, must have had 40 in it, and think you can work backwards like a clock. Okay, it's not, that's a very simplified version because there's a ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. You've got to presume how much was in the organism when it died and so on. But anyway, just suffice to say that the half-life of carbon-14 is short compared to other radioisotopes that are used for dating. And in fact, at the observed decay rates, you should not find carbon-14 in anything more than about 60,000 years of age. It would have decayed out. So I want to say here, let's be generous. Let's stretch that out to 100,000 years.
Okay.
Would be undetectable.
All right.
Well, how is it then that all dinosaur fossils that have been sent off to radiometric dating labs come back with carbon-14 in them?
Shouldn't be in there, should it?
It shouldn't be there. So, and I want to make sure I get my dates correct. There's a friend of ours called Vance Nelson. I'll give you an example. He sent an Edmontosaurus toe bone to a world-leading radiometric dating ab in America, and the Edmontosaurus is supposed to have existed 98 million years ago. And guess what? Comes back with carbon-14 in it. So this is not just an isolated example. All fossils that have been sent off for carbon-14 testing, including coal. So coal is supposed to have been formed in carboniferous peat bogs, 330 to 350 million years ago.
Wow. Yeah.
But it's petrified plant material, compressed plant material. So it was once organic, comes back with carbon-14 in it. Should not be there. And some years ago, they accused creationist organizations, when they released those results, of fudging the samples. So I want to make a point here. So that assumption was tested. They sent diamonds, pure carbon, off to radiometric dating labs. Now, we all know diamonds are the hardest substance known to man. And the reason is the lattice bonds are so strong, they're impervious to outside contamination. Okay. And they're supposed to be billions of years old, formed under deep heat and pressure in kind of the basement rocks or the bowels of the earth, and they came back with carbon-14 in them as well. So it's just not dinosaur fossils that are supposed to be tens of millions of years old, coal hundreds of millions of years old, diamonds supposedly billions of years old have carbon-14 in them. Now, is this a recent find? Yes, it's been recent, but there are literally now hundreds of examples. But it was actually known as far back as 2012. And I did a bit of research on this. So in 2012, there was an international conference in Singapore called the Western Pacific Geophysics meeting. And two scientists presented a paper which they gave carbon-14 dating results from numerous bone samples, in fact, 10 dinosaur specimens, right? That were supposed to be millions and millions of years old. They gave a presentation. It was online. That could be watched live. And they got so many complaints from their colleagues that they actually censored it. They censored their paper from the proceedings and expunged the presentation from the conference. Fortunately, it's still available on the website if people want to have a look. I'll repeat it, the Western Pacific Geophysics meeting 2012, where they gave that. And basically they said the reason they expunged it is they could not accept the findings. And yet this was peer-reviewed paper that they had presented from two credible scientists. So again, many people would say, oh, it's outside contamination, but we're still dealing with the same issue that we did with soft tissue. All over the world, different locations from different time zones, we're finding carbon-14. When you get those consistent results, it is obvious that the dinosaur bones themselves, the fossils, are not tens of millions of years old. They're only thousands of years old.
So what you've presented today, Gary, seems almost unbelievable. And I'm sure in the case of a lot of listeners, this will be something that's really hard to hear. But why don't most people hear about this evidence really at all?
Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think that just for some people, it's too challenging. The last couple of evidences we've spoken about have been on scientific lines. But I mentioned earlier, it's not really about the science. You see, I said dinosaurs are kind of a poster child for evolution. They're right then smack bang in the middle. They're incredible creatures, so they're often used to portray the truth of evolutionary history from the Earth. But if I'm an evolutionist, if I'm a PhD scientist or a paleontologist who've studied this my whole life, and suddenly evidence that comes up that might say everything you've believed might not be true.
That would be quite hard to hear.
Yeah. And if it's not true in terms of the evolutionary history, what's the alternative?
Well,
maybe the Bible might be true. Maybe the biblical creationist model and dinosaurs lived only thousands of years ago might be true. So suddenly we've gone from an academic argument to something that's much, much more personal.
And like those presentations in 2012, all of a sudden this actually makes you really reconsider what you've been thinking this whole time.
Yeah. But you know what it really boils down to? Is there a God?
All right, yeah.
I mean, where do we know about God? I mean, we can talk about our experiences, but ultimately we go to the Bible, we go to Scripture, where it gives us an indication of God being creator. We read about everything that went wrong, that the world needs a savior, and then in the New Testament we read about Jesus Christ. That's the history of the world. That's the history of the universe recorded there, not a man-made invention, right? Based, I think we've shown, on misinterpretation of geologic layers, fossil interpretation, which we can, the same evidence and facts we can account for, again with the biblical interpretation, Noah's flood, right? So we're talking about fossils. Most fossils are going to need a rapid burial. That's what we see in the fossil record. We spoke before about the out-of-order fossils, but you've got to have creatures buried quickly to preserve them. The conditions of Noah's flood meets that. The flood waters were on the earth for over a year, 371 days. So if most of those rock layers were laid down by the 12 months of Noah's flood, there's no millions of years. If there's no millions of years, there's no time for evolution to happen. And then suddenly my worldview no longer exists.
It's crumbling away.
Yeah. So I think in some respects, even though it is an academic issue, I think it's also a spiritual issue because it's just too hard to believe. Look, I'm a former evolutionist. At one stage I would have ridiculed the creation view. But the reason was I'd never heard any of this stuff. I'd never heard of this evidence, this information. And the more that obviously, I look at it and I've seen nothing, to be frank, in my 30 years that I can't reconcile with the biblical creation model. But James, we've just spoken about stuff here that's very hard to reconcile with the evolutionary model.
Yes.
Scientific evidence, carbon-14, soft tissue, that defies the tens of millions of years interpretation. So it's a spiritual issue, And so we said, when we look at the fossils, what are the fossils? The fossils and the rock layers, if they came from Noah's flood, was a judgment upon the earth, a judgment by the Creator upon sin that was occurring on the earth. You know what the Bible says? There's going to be a future judgment. A future judgment, not by flood, but by fire. And this is something we often don't like to talk about in the church. We don't like to talk about God being judged, but if he's the creator, he has the right to have a say over his creation. If he's pure and holy, he cannot tolerate sin. And the only way, obviously, you and I are going to escape that future judgment is by believing in the one whom God sent. And so I'd ask anybody, like myself, they could be really confronted by what they've heard today. They could be saying, that's just ridiculous. And probably even accuse us of lying because the evidence is just so confronting to what they've believed and been told. But I would like to think that people at least would believe, as a Christian, I might get some things wrong, but at least I'm compelled to tell the truth. And what we presented here are actual scientific findings. And I would say to people that you need then to question what you've been taught traditionally. evolution, no question, is the ruling paradigm, the predominant worldview that's taught in our education systems today. But I don't think it's right.
So, Gary, we've talked about 5 different points of why dinosaurs couldn't have existed millions of years ago. I see that there's been a book on this table this entire time. Could you tell us a bit about what that could actually mean for us in further readings or understanding?
Yeah, well, we have only been speaking for an hour or so and covered briefly, but there is lots and lots of information on what I spoke about today. If people care to search it out, go to creation.com, type in dinosaur soft tissue, carbon-14 and dinosaur fossils on creation.com. They'll get some. But these podcasts, the ministry is really generous in making resources available for people to get more information. So this is a key book, a core book that the ministry produces called the Creation Answers book. And it kind of is the most asked questions we get. And no surprise, dinosaurs fills one of those chapters in here. So in 20 chapters, there are actually over 60 questions answered. Okay. Who did Cain marry? Where did the races come from? How do we see distant starlight from millions or billions light years away if we believe that the universe, according to the biblical age, is only thousands of years old? So, and to be honest, people often with these podcasts will put in questions there that they think creationists haven't thought of or answered. But in my experience, they generally have been pretty much covered already. And so this is a great book to do that. So they're going to make that available, I believe, in an ebook form. That'll be in the description below. So that's available, and just fill out your details and you can get a free ebook. Link in the description. Grab your free ebook, especially if you have any questions that may arise about creationism or dinosaurs for this matter. Well, Gary, thank you for your time and your knowledge. It's been really insightful. I honestly think I've walked away with so much more knowledge about dinosaurs, and let's be honest, carbon-14 dating. I didn't even really know how that worked, but thank you for your time again. You're welcome.